I'm excited to talk about John Warner Barber, who, as Tobias noted, was an essential chronicler of our community. And because of his work, there are things that we have access to and know. He never was a professional librarian, but he really was a librarian in many ways, and in the highest sense of that. I'm grateful to Barber for what he did, as you will understand as I talk for a little bit now. And I want to begin with gratitude to all of my colleagues at Beinecke Library, at Yale Library overall, and at the Whitney Library and the New Haven Museum, key partners with us in the work of bringing the past to light in the present for the future, and key partners in the story of John Warner Barber. Barber is someone whose name may not be on the tip of your or most people's tongues. And when I ask people, do you know John Warner Barber? Most people don't. And yet his images are ubiquitous. I know that because as I was walking down Chapel Street and looked in the window at Merwin's the other day, there's John Warner Barber, and he's inside in the walls. And if you know New Haven and Connecticut in the mid and early 19th century, you know John Warner Barber. He is the one who did so many of the images that remain in circulation about New Haven, Connecticut, and even beyond. Barber was prolific. This is a list of some of the works that he did on the left. He had a principal role as the author or co-author, compiler, or illustrator of more than 30 books. They had nearly 100 reprints. He was a contributor to many books without his name and was an illustrator for almanacs, encyclopedias, technical works, and other publications, such as Jedediah Morse's Geographies. His first published book was Views in New Haven and its vicinity in 1825. He did a book about the US, a small book. And then he did a book again about New Haven in 1831 that led to an omnibus book, Historical Collections of Connecticut, which sold 7,000 copies in 1836, which is really extraordinary. That led to a work about Massachusetts. He did many other works, sometimes with Henry Howe. And he did in 1861, published a book about the entire history called Our Whole Country, Historical and Descriptive. He did a number of religious books, including one, The Bible Looking Glass, which sold 120,000 copies in 1874. So Barber's images are ubiquitous. His works are prolific. He is someone who is a key catalyst for contemporary reckoning. And I recommend that all watch the documentary, which Tobias directed, about a key story of New Haven, the story of what could have been a proposal, a radical and path-breaking proposal for a Black college that was intended to be established in New Haven in 1831. We know the story, we know what happened in large part because of John Warner Barber. And yet John Warner Barber himself is not so fully known. This is his tombstone at the Grove Street Cemetery, which has fallen down, and the cemetery is working to restore it. Many stones of this type and the material degrade over time, so this is not uncommon to see what happened to Barber's stone, but the cemetery is planning to put it back up. And this, in some ways, signifies Barber himself as a person, as I mentioned, is not a household name. His work is known and important, but he is not fully known. Wanted to share a little bit about him before going into some reading between the lines of his diary. What I'm sharing now comes from Dick Hegel, Richard Hegel, great leader in the New Haven Colony Historical Society, now the New Haven Museum, city historian, the late city historian of New Haven, great historian. And what Dick wrote about Barber was adapted in large part from what Henry Townsend wrote and spoke about Barber in a talk at the New Haven Museum, the then New Haven Colony Historical Society, in the 1940s, that was published by the New Haven Colony Historical Society in the 1950s. And I quote now from Dick Hegel. John Warner Barber is equally well known for his historical writings and for their attendant illustrations. Barber was born in Windsor, Connecticut on February 2nd, 1798. He died in New Haven, Connecticut on June 22nd, 1885. He was the second of 6 children. His father was a relatively poor farmer. It is not known if John Warner Barber attended school. During the summer of 1812, when Barber was 14, his father died and he assumed support of the family. His mother died in 1839. Barber apprenticed to Abner Reed in Windsor, the great printer of banknotes. And in 1823, after living in Hartford for a little while, Barber moved to New Haven, where he would live for the rest of his life. On the left, you see an illustration of Barber's childhood home done by Barber himself. And on the right, you see a picture of Barber's home in New Haven at number 346 George Street, where is now a building of the Child Study Center close to the Blake Hotel in that area of downtown on George Street. And this picture comes from the extraordinary resource of the Dana scrapbooks that are held by the New Haven Museum. We have great access to John Warner Barber's life because of this item in the New Haven Museum, his line-a-day diary, which he kept for nearly his entire life, from when he was a teen until he died. He hardly ever missed. The only time he missed is when he was very, very sick, but he almost always recorded something every day. On the left is 1823, as he's coming to New Haven. 1824, one of the entries, which is quite typical, he records major events. In this case, the arrival of the Marquis de Lafayette in New Haven. Next year is the bicentennial of Lafayette's famous tour of America in 1824. And you see in May 1825 that Barber moved into George Street, that home that you saw the picture of before, where he lived until he died in 1885. In 1828, we see that Barber is engraving a map of Africa. He recorded his work in this line diary. And you see in 1828, one of the first recordings that he went to church at what is said here, the African Meeting House, at the African Ecclesiastical Society, or the Temple Street Congregational Church, what is now the Dixwell Avenue Congregational United Church of Christ, that was originally on Temple Street, the nation's oldest formally recognized Black congregational church. Barber was a very devout and serious Christian who went to church 2 and sometimes 3 times every Sunday, and who frequently throughout his life worshiped with the Temple Street Church, with the African Ecclesiastical Society, with the nation's oldest Black congregational church. He recorded on Sundays typically where he went to church, who preached, and what the subject was. So you see in the middle here that one Sunday the subject was, "A rich man shall hardly enter the kingdom of heaven." In 1830, we see again that he's at the African church and that Mr. Jocelyn preached. Simeon Jocelyn was an important person in the arts in New Haven and was an important person in religion. He was a white man who was the first pastor of the Black Congregational Church, an important figure in New Haven and in the nation. Moving to 1830, we see again that Barber is in the evening services at the Temple Street Church, at the Black Congregational Church, and that there was a meeting that evening about colonization, African colonization in Canada. In September 1830, we see that he went twice to the Black Congregational Church. And moving into 1831, a key year for Barber and in the history of our city, we see again in early February that he's with Mr. Jocelyn and the congregants at the Temple Street Church at the African Ecclesiastical Society. He notes in his diary an important event that year, the great eclipse of February 12th, 1831. More recordings of his work and his days. One Sunday, he went to church 3 times and heard sermons on choose whom you will serve. There is no peace to the wicked. And to bring it home, I will follow thee wheresoever thou goest. April, again, at the Black Congregational Church, where Mr. Jocelyn was the pastor. And in May, you see that he even more frequently is going to the Black Congregational Church on May the 1st, on May the 8th, on May the 15th, on May the 22nd, and on May the 29th. All 5 Sundays in May, he is present at the Black Congregational Church. In June 1831, the first 2 Sundays, he worships, among other places, at the chapel, which would have been the Yale Chapel. And you see that he, on the 19th of June, is not only at the Black Congregational Church, but he's one of the readers of the scripture. The next day, a Monday, it reports that he was at Mr. Jocelyn's for dinner for a repast. And then on June 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, 1831, he notes that William Lloyd Garrison was in New Haven and gave each night addresses on slavery. Barber underlines in his diary every once in a while, and it is clearly a mark of something that really matters. And sometimes he does things in writes over them so that they are bold. And the appearance of Garrison gets the call out and the underlying. So this was clearly important. Garrison was on his way back to Boston from Philadelphia, where he and Simeon Jocelyn, along with Arthur Tappan, had joined with the nation's free Black leadership at the first annual convention of people of color in Philadelphia to propose and agree upon a plan to build the nation's first Black college, what we would call an HBCU in New Haven. The convention of the free Black leadership had agreed to this plan, and it was decided to do it in New Haven. The national committee and agents were formed. Surely Garrison was talking about that path-breaking proposal as he came back through New Haven on his way from Philadelphia back home to Boston and spoke 3 nights, the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th of June, 1831. In July, again, Barber is often at the Black Congregational Church. On the 24th of July, the text was, "The last shall be first." The last Sunday in July, he's worshiping where President Jeremiah Day of Yale is the preacher. And this is a reminder that New Haven was a very highly interconnected place in 1831. The population was about 10,000, and pretty much everybody knew everybody else. And so Barber knew Yale, Yale knew Barber. As I mentioned at the beginning from Dick Hegel, we don't know that Barber himself had any formal education. So he appears to have been self-taught and have learned in community with others. He interacted with many at Yale, did lots of work for Yale faculty, Benjamin Silliman and others for their publications, and would have known President Day of Yale very well and other leaders at Yale. In August 1831, we see that he is finishing his book about New Haven, and again that he worships in the Black Congregational Church, where he was a regular participant and congregant. And then in September 1831, we see probably the most heavily marked entry in the diary, indicating that this is an especially important event. Underlined, really heavily underscored, and we see that on the 10th of September, 1831, there is the city meeting on the African College, on the Black College. The proposal had been made in June, had been published and circulated. And the mayor of New Haven, Dennis Kimberly, a Yale graduate, on September 6, 1831, called an extraordinary town meeting of the freemen, the white male property owners who had the right to vote, to discuss the college and to vote on resolutions against the college. The resolutions passed 700-4. The leadership of New Haven, the white male property-owning leadership, voted 700-4 against the Black College. Barber marked this date and this event in his diary as being particularly important. We see that the next day, a Sunday, he went to worship with his neighbors at the Black Congregational Church, whose leadership were the local leaders in the national effort to build a Black college. The next day, a Monday, he is at the offices of Nathaniel Jocelyn, assisting Simeon Jocelyn, probably assisting the Jocelyn brothers in printing and engraving work, but also surely talking and mourning and thinking and strategizing with Jocelyn about the Black College proposal. The next Sunday, the 18th of September, just 8 days after the vote, Barber records that he went to Trinity Church, the Episcopal Church, where the Reverend Mr. Croswell was presiding as pastor and preached. And Barber notes, he doesn't do this often when people are visiting church, he notes that the United States Secretary of War, Lewis Cass, was present, which is very interesting to think about. Lewis Cass was a national leader. He was a favorite of President Jackson, and he was the national leader in popular sovereignty, in states' rights, that said that states should be able to decide whether slavery was present in their state or not. That notion of popular sovereignty was encoded in the very resolutions that New Haven had passed against the Black College. And one wonders what kind of conversations Cass had with New Haven's leadership. And it's very interesting that the national leader of popular sovereignty was present just 8 days after that vote had happened. You see, as the year goes on, that Barber continues to worship with his neighbors and comrades in the Black Congregational Church. You see in October 21st, 1831, that his important History and Antiquities of New Haven is published. He surely mourned what happened and the fact that New Haven's leadership voted 700-4 against the proposal for a Black college. He loved this place extraordinarily, as he loved Connecticut, and that is very clear in his many books about New Haven and about Connecticut, including the History and Antiquities of New Haven. So one can imagine the emotions that he felt as he both praised this place, but also knew what had happened and what the leadership of this place had voted on just a month before he published that book. Moving into 1832, again, you see that he continues to worship with the Black Congregational Church. This was not something that was rare for him. It would continue throughout his life, as we will see. And to jump ahead a little bit, in 1840, he is once again present at one of the most important events in the history of this city, an event that had lots of interest and attention and coverage throughout the country and beyond. And that was the trial of the Amistad rebels who had overtaken a boat and had liberated themselves and were on trial here in New Haven. They had been brought to New Haven in 1839, were held in the New Haven prison, and were on trial here. You see that Barber was present every day at court, and he would publish an important book about the Amistad trial, including a great illustration that he did of the Amistad rebels liberating themselves, taking over the ship, as well as profiles of all of the people in that important story. So again, he's one of the chroniclers in his time that gives us information now nearly 2 centuries later to understand what happened before us and how it shaped the world in which we live now. To move ahead to 1854, we see that in fact, as the years went on, as the decades went on, he worshiped even more frequently at the Black Congregational Church, here noted as Mr. Beeman's church, after the Reverend Mr. Amos Beeman, pastor of the church. You see that in May 21st, 1854, the preacher was a fugitive. The Temple Street Congregational Church, now the Dixwell Avenue Congregational United Church of Christ, was one of the key places in New Haven and Connecticut on the Underground Railroad. And you see that at the end of that month, on May 28th, that Barber was reading an account of fugitives. So he was always in the midst of organizing and an ally in the liberation movement. In 1864, to jump ahead a decade, you see that Barber is present again at the Black Congregational Church, and it notes that the colored soldiers were present because the 29th Connecticut Black Regiment was mustering in New Haven. They would go off to fight in the Civil War, part of the Black troops who helped win the Civil War and keep the nation whole. The next day, his diary reports that he was drawing a mob in New York, likely an image of the white New York draft riots of the previous year. A couple of days later, he's writing for events of the war, and you see throughout his diary that he was engaged in learning about and reporting on the events of his day in New Haven and throughout the nation. And then another big underscore and emphasis, very important date and event for the 29th Regiment, for New Haven and for Connecticut, and that's on January 28, 1864, when Frederick Douglass was in New Haven and gave a lecture at the Music Hall. That seems to be something that fits with what was the text at the next Sunday service at the Black Congregational Church. Barber was present, and the text was, "Let us rise up and build." In 1871, to jump ahead a few years, you see that he again is worshiping very frequently at the Black Congregational Church. Mr. Lathrop was the deacon of the church, and he was often preaching. You see that Barber was present for funerals. He was present when visiting preachers like Professor Harris and Bishop Moore came through the church. Mr. Anderson in 1878 is another pastor of the church, a successor of the Reverend Mr. Beeman. And you see that he's worshiping regularly, even more regularly as the decades go on with his neighbors in the Black Congregational Church. The last page that I'll show, and again, there are numerous pages because Barber kept this line diary with a page for each month of every year for decades and decades and decades. But I will close on this page where again underscores that he is worshiping frequently with his neighbors at the Black Congregational Church. Mr. Rollins is another pastor of the Temple Street, or now the Dixwell Avenue Church. And he notes, and again, an important date, that on the 18th of August, 1879, his dear friend and compatriot, the Reverend Simeon S. Jocelyn, died at Tarrytown at 80 years. On the right are just some images of Jocelyn, of Beeman, of Daniel Lathrop, son of Luke Lathrop, the deacon, to indicate some of the people who were in Barber's world and whose world included John Warner Barber. What we see in the diary, in his sort of private diary, gets expressed in his public work in a variety of ways, by which I mean his commitment to philanthropy, what we would consider an intersectional sense of allyship. In his interesting events about the United States, one of his earliest works in 1829, and throughout all of his works, he foregrounds indigenous populations. The language is dated and could have been problematic in its own time, but it is much more progressive than much of what one sees in dominant culture writing at the time. And he really does foreground the stories of indigenous peoples in many of his works. His Connecticut historical collections, which continues to be an important resource for historians of this state and residents of this state, is an interesting book where Barber went out and talked to people in every town and wrote sections about every town in Connecticut and drew important places in every town. I wanted to go back as we come to a close to something Dick Hegel wrote, and I quote again. Barber added that he had paid particular attention to many subjects usually passed over by those who write customary histories and who believe such matters trivial. He noted that considerable amounts of historical material have been lost by not preserving such miscellaneous fragments of information in written form. Barber noted changing historical perspectives, pointing out that what appears to be unimportant to historians at one period may well be considered significant at a later date. He believed that old newspapers are among the best sources for information dealing with earlier times, close quote from Richard Hegel. These are three bits of scores of items in the historical collections that really exemplify what Dick Hegel was saying about Barber's foresight in collecting various things that at the time people have thought may not have mattered. These are three ads that he reproduces in historical collections about the sale of human property that remind us that Connecticut was a place where human trafficking happened. It was a place where there was enslavement. And because of books like Barber's, we have easier access to the record of reality of our past. In his Connecticut historical collections, in the section on Canterbury, he, as would not surprise us, knowing who he is and what he stood for, spent a lot of the Canterbury section talking about Prudence Crandall and her school for Black women. He treats her, not surprisingly, Crandall, with great respect, and he notes the hypocrisy of the Canterbury and of Connecticut. He notes that she was attacked, and I quote here, subjected to a variety of insults and injuries, which, if not approved and countenanced by the more respectable inhabitants, were at least suffered to pass with an impunity that would have hardly attended them had any other person been the injured party. Barber, of course, has sympathy and allyship with Crandall and what she was doing. In the Beinecke Library, we hold a number of manuscript account books about John Warner Barber and by John Warner Barber. These are in his hand. They are his business books, but he also used them to jot down notes about things that he was writing. Here are two bits about Cassius M. Clay, the Kentuckian and anti-slavery advocate, and on the right about William Wilberforce, someone whom clearly Barber had an affinity and who he notes denounced, quote, the odious traffic in human flesh. Barber's books about New Haven record details that, again, may not have been seen to have been of historic importance in their time, but he had foresight. We see good lists and censuses of all the churches, including the Black churches, of all the schools, including the Black schools. This is a close-up of his updated History and Antiquities of New Haven from 1856. That also includes a timeline. And we see here that in 1831, Barber considers that vote of the city meeting to repudiate the Black College to be one of the most important events that happened in New Haven. He was not afraid to put the bad down with the good and to remind us of what mattered in this community. These are more from the account books that are in Beinecke, his manuscript account books, which again include many texts that he's working out. These are some poems that likely showed up or were considered for some of his religious tracts, and they exemplify his commitment to fighting against white supremacy. On the left is a poem that may not be high literary form, but it really does tell us what Barber thought. He writes, "To treat a man because his skin is dark with proud contempt and cruel withering scorn, oh, how unlike our Lord who came to earth to save mankind was in a stable born." And you see that note that Christianity stands against slavery, Christianity stands against racism throughout the decades of Barber's life and writing. And finally, a document that we in Beinecke Library, Tobias and I and our colleagues, are very appreciative of Barber for. This pamphlet records what happened in New Haven in 1831, and we are the stewards of Barber's copy of this pamphlet, which he no doubt worked to compile with Simeon Jocelyn. It was then published at the request of the Black leadership of the nation, who requested of Jocelyn that he put together what happened and why the vote happened to go against the college. The pamphlet is very much like Barber's Connecticut historical collections. It's news clips and other reprints. It shares information that matters. It includes a play, a very short little play that Barber himself wrote that was published in a New Haven newspaper, that is a short little dramatic piece that shows up New Haven for its hypocrisy and that connects the vote against the Black college with the removal of indigenous populations from Georgia happening around the same time. Is a play against both of those, about both against the people who opposed the Black college and those who were promoting removal of indigenous people. So again, in our contemporary terms, we can consider Barber to be an intersectional person in his allyship and in his support for his fellow neighbors in Connecticut and around the country. This document, this pamphlet, has two marks by Barber that really do embody who he is and what he means for us today. On the front, he has written, "To be carefully preserved." He, as in his diary, makes marks of what matters. This clearly matters, and he wanted his heirs to make sure that this was preserved. On the inside is his signature, and just to be sure, the message is there again, "To be preserved," in case the front cover comes off or his family didn't read what he said, his instructions on the front. Happily, it has been preserved. It's come down to us as the gift of Timothy Clark and Mrs. Early McIntosh, and was from the library of a Yale alum, Merritt Clark, who was a key collector of Barber materials. So it has, in fact, been carefully preserved. It has been preserved, and it has been a seed from which we can reconstruct the important story of the Black leaders and their white allies who tried to create a Black college in New Haven in 1831, of their vision and their resilience, as well as of the extraordinary opposition and oppression they faced from the standing order in this community in 1831. I will close with Barber's obituary written by Henry Howe, his great collaborator, his co-author. Henry Howe was the son of the New Haven bookseller and important leader Hezekiah Howe. Henry Howe knew Barber, was inspired to go into printing, engraving, and writing because of Barber, and worked with him through many decades in the second half of Barber's life. the obituary is pasted into the great line diary at the New Haven Museum. And I quote from Howe in this obituary about Barber. From his early years, his sympathies were ever with the poor and the oppressed. Believing in the equality of human rights as advocated in the teachings of Christ, he always opposed everything to the contrary in whatever form it appeared. This led him, when quite a young man, to remonstrate with some members of the church with which he was connected against the Negro pew in a house erected for worship as totally opposed to all Christian principles. In other words, Barber, as a young man in the early 1800s, stood against segregation in his church. Returning to the obituary, I quote again about his commitment to social justice. Howe writes of Barber, as he grew older, this feeling increased. On the 10th of September, 1831, he was one of the unpopular four who lifted up their right hands as a protest against the resolutions passed at a town meeting of the citizens of New Haven, denouncing the establishment of a literary institution in the city for the education of Blacks. To use his own expression in regard to himself, it is to be hoped that when the final summing up of all things is made, it will appear that he has not lived in vain. It is remarkable to think about John Warner Barber, who lived 88 years, all of his adult years in this great city of New Haven, the city he loved, the city he chronicled, and a city where he worshiped across racial lines to build a more beloved community, where he supported the vision of the Black leadership to build a college that was thwarted by the white standing order, where he took risks, and where he, as this obituary notes, was, quote, one of the unpopular four. Let us honor Barber by engaging with his work, and also by trying to be people who, like him, as we grow older, our feelings for justice increase, so that, like him, when the final summing up of all things is done, it will appear that we have not lived in vain. Barber gives us resources to know who we are, where we come from. It's up to us to decide where we'll go, but he gives us some good resources so that we will not be in vain.